So the government is warning Canadians to take caution when visiting China after a Canadian suddenly found himself on death row. Robert Schellenberg was convicted of attempting to smuggle drugs from China to Australia, sentenced to 15 years in prison originally, but a few weeks after the arrest of Huawei's top executive Meng Wanzhou in Canada, prosecutors in China suddenly appealed the ruling, and after a speedy second trial, he now faces the death penalty. Is this a politically motivated decision, as the Foreign Affairs Minister says? And with this, does Canada now need to take a tougher stance with China? I want to bring in MPs now. With me in studio, Mona Fortier is the Liberal MP for Ontario. Aaron O'Toole is a Conservative Foreign Affairs critic. Nathan Cullen is the NDP MP. He is from British Columbia, but in Toronto right now. Great to have all of you here. Aaron O'Toole, let me start with you.
Great to be here.
This is escalating very quickly. Does the Prime Minister have to take a tougher stance with China now?
Absolutely. The Prime Minister at least needs to get involved. He was aware of the situation before the original arrest of a Chinese citizen. He now appears to be waiting until he can have a photo op that makes it look like he's had success. He's not willing to be a leader to actually insert himself.
But to do what? Like, what do you want him to do exactly?
Well, they're calling 20, 30 other countries, Evan, but not calling the one country detaining Canadians. They won't even say that these arrests are retaliation, although they're calling other countries trying to enlist them on their side. The Prime Minister needs to have a frank talk with President Xi and say, we have rule of law in Canada, we can assure you fair treatment of your citizen, we need to ensure our Canadian citizens are treated fairly and released. Okay,
Nathan Cullen, there's words. Is it time for Canada, for example, to kick out the Chinese ambassador? Does Canada need to take a stronger action?
Well, I think the conversation that Aaron just spoke about is now overdue. This is literally a life and death situation for a Canadian. China has been trying to make a bid to the world that you can trade with us and democracy and human rights will improve. And in making that bid, are showing themselves to be autocratic and unwilling to participate and have an actual conversation. But we do need our Prime Minister to step up, talk to his counterpart in China to say, the road you're going down is incredibly dangerous, it's lethal for this individual, but it is also incredibly dangerous for China's reputation around the world.
Okay, so Mona Fortier, why not? Why not pick up the phone and call President Xi, at least say, now that we've got a Canadian on death row, why isn't he doing that?
So our goal right now is to bring these Canadians back home, safe and sound. That is what we're working on. And Minister Freeland and even the Prime Minister are working closely with the allies to find that solution to bring them back home. But the question is, so this is what we're focusing on.
I know, but working with the allies, what about China? China's got the key to the jail cells. Why not phone President Xi?
Again, I think it's important that we focus on working with our allies, and the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland are working together to get those steps and those Canadians back home.
Okay. To be fair, I don't know what that means 100%, but can you just tell me what your government's response is to the Chinese ambassador's threats? There'll be repercussions if we enlist allies. There'll be repercussions if we don't let Huawei join our next generation wireless. What's the specific response to threats from China?
I won't start putting any explanation on that part because it's a very high sensitive issue, and the focus is really on trying to get those Canadians back home. I know that the ambassador was in committee, in-camera committee, to share some information with the members of Parliament, part of that committee, and he was clear in his interview of that everything that we're doing is right now to bring these Canadians back home.
Do you buy that?
There were no answers, Evan. In fact, there's more questions. The one thing that is clear, there's never been a plan. The Prime Minister was advised ahead of the arrest of the Chinese citizen because of the political sensitivities. They knew it's unusual for a Prime Minister to get a briefing before an arrest like that. They had no plan then, and they have no plan now. And Minister McCallum said the Prime Minister is the last arrow in the quiver. It seems they only want to pull that arrow out when all things are good, so that he can look good. But leadership means taking an active role to fight for those citizens' rights and to take a role improving the relationship, because there's hundreds of thousands of Canadians in China working, living in Hong Kong, and thousands of families have questions, and they're really worried there's no answers.
Nathan Cullen, I'm trying to get at what you know, the Chinese are not mincing words. If Chrystia Freeland goes to Davos and tries to enlist support, they say that will escalate tensions. If we don't let Huawei join the 5G, there's going to be repercussions. What do you make of these? They're very openly and unabashedly threatening Canada.
Well, that's the word you just said right there. These are threats. These are open public threats. If you have the audacity to go and talk to your allies about one of your citizens on death row in China, and we know the so-called Chinese justice system is anything but just, and if we have the audacity to, as our other allies have done, to look at Huawei, this company in particular, and say they present a national security threat if we allow them to be the backbone of our 5G mobile network. And the idea that China can just make these threats publicly to the Canadian government, and Mr. Trudeau doesn't phone up his counterpart in China and say, if you're looking to trade with the world, stop it. And if you want to gain some favor and some understanding between our two different countries, then you have to not execute this Canadian.
Mona Fortier, I understand you want to release the Canadians. It's sensitive. But in the meantime, does it look like Canada's being weak? We're being dictated to what we can and can't do. We're being threatened, and there's very little response. Even China's mocking Canada's attempt to get allies. The spokesperson for President Xi said Canada has so-called allies that you can count on 10 fingers. What is the Canadian government's response?
So Canada believes in rule of law and due process, and the steps that we are taking with the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland and the allies, and also working with the parties, because we really want to make sure that our Canadians are safe and sound. So that's what we're doing.
Let me just ask you, if there are steps outside, you're not phoning the president, are you going to kick out the Chinese ambassador? Is that an option?
I couldn't comment on that at this time. I think we're looking at all of our options. It's important that we remind ourselves that we don't want to jeopardize anything. So we are taking everything.
This is why the Prime Minister is not acting, Evan, is he set as one of the goals of his foreign policy in his 4 years in government a free trade agreement with China. That's not only in shambles now, the relationship with that country is at risk, and Canadian citizens are being drawn into a dispute that our own Prime Minister is not even willing to try and help resolve.
And your party would say no free trade deal now with China?
Absolutely not. Okay. Under the certain circumstances we're seeing now, we have to be strong, and the Chinese will actually respect us being stronger.
Okay. Last word to you, Nathan Cullen. Would the NDP also now take any kind of free trade deal with China off the table, or do we have to take, outside of calling President Xi, is there any immediate action we could take?
The great offer Canada made to China was this trade deal option, because that then qualifies, it sanctifies China's trade policies, their own domestic policies, because the world would say, oh look, Canada signed a free trade deal with China, they might be okay to deal with. All of these actions, the threats, the arrest, the putting a Canadian on death row, speak to the reality of Chinese policy right now with President Xi. And the fact that Trudeau stepped in, offered this up, without the concessions that we were going to need and the assurances that Canadians are going to need in dealing with China, speaks to me of a naivete that is worrisome coming from this government.
All right, I got to leave it there. Mona Fortier, Aaron O'Toole, Nathan Cullen, thanks a lot for being here. Appreciate that.